Hello, welcome everyone to today's conversation. Thanks for those who have joined us live and for those who are tuning in on demand. My name is Charlie Windschill. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing at Ortto, and I'm here today to talk to you a bit about how you can start to take a retention first approach to growth. And I'm joined by Amy. Amy, welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about all things retention.
Yeah, and before we dive in and give a little bit more of an introduction, just acknowledging that we did say that we had Daniel joining us today as well. If you saw that name on the screen, unfortunately, he's down for the count, a bit ill today. So you've got Amy and I. So why don't we go ahead and just do some brief introductions? Amy, if you wouldn't mind, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's a shame that Daniel can't be with us today, but I will hold down the fort
Nice.
for the Ikaros team. So hi, everyone. Thanks for everyone joining live and for those of you who are going to be watching this on demand. My name's Amy. I'm a growth principal at Ikaros, Ikaros being a growth and analytics consultancy firm. So a bit of background about myself. I've been working in marketing for 9 years, with the last 7 of them being focused more in this like growth space. So at the intersection of product, marketing, and data. So my role at Ikaros is a growth principal. I manage a few of our different client engagements. So understanding what our clients' goals are, what their OKRs are, and how we can put together a growth strategy that helps them to achieve that.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of really great stories and experiences to share with us. So I'm looking forward to that. For those of you who I haven't met already, my name is Charlie again, and I've been with Ortto for about a year now. We are a marketing automation and analytics platform. My background is in the B2B SaaS space. I've been with a number of companies, including Mixpanel, Lattice, Showpad, to name a few, and always in this kind of growth and demand generation type focused roles. And so I've had a number of different experiences in shifting focus between acquisition and retention across these different companies. I'm hoping to bring a little bit of that background and experience to the conversation today as well. And I think the reason that Amy and I felt this was such a timely conversation, and surely you've seen retention come up, across our various channels, is just the kind of needs and changes in the market today, and the focus on where can we drive growth when we're no longer in this acquire at all costs space where money is cheap and easy to find, and what can we as marketers do to pivot our strategies. And so that's why we wanted to come to the conversation today and share a little bit about how we've adjusted our strategies, what we've put forward, what changes we've made. We'll talk at some kind of general and high level terms, but we also hope to dive into some very specific and tangible examples. And so I think maybe a good place to start would just be talking about that shift. And so, Amy, maybe you could talk to us a bit about how you've seen retention play a role in the marketer's toolkit. How is that changing in particular in recent months?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. So you kind of put it perfectly. In recent months, there has been companies that thought they were originally going to have access to more capital. They're no longer able to raise funds. We've really seen this shift from companies focusing on this growth at all cost strategy to now, how can we focus and pivot to more of this profitable growth? And we really have seen a shift in focus from what is the latest like super sexy acquisition growth hack and a focus on like virality and top of the funnel, and what are these like ways that we can continue to grow leads and top of the funnel, into more like how can we be land and expanding with our current customer base, and also focusing on how we can be doing more with less, right? So I think it's more timely now than ever to talk about retention. But in my opinion, I really think the retention needs to be something that is focused on from the get-go, with any marketer's initial strategy. I think that good retention is so important for sustainable growth. Understanding your retention, understanding what that retention metric looks like, and knowing how your retention slope is looking. It's a bit too dangerous to not understand that and have your retention slope be somewhat trending towards that 0 point. You really need to have your retention curve being able to get to like a stable point of every some subset of every cohort of users that you're bringing onto the platform are actually retaining. So from my perspective, like, yes, it's great that people are now focusing more on retention because of this kind of economic time that we're in, but it always needs to be a fundamental part of a marketer's strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think you're touching on something here that some of the folks who maybe listen are like, wait a minute, I have been working on these retention tactics over time. I think the acknowledgement is, yes, absolutely. A lot of really strong marketing organizations and growth organizations have had an eye on retention. It's the call out here is heavier emphasis, or if you've been in a luxurious position where you've been, maybe 100% focused on acquisition, now's the time to divert a little bit of attention. And I want to share a report that I thought was really well done. Let me just share my screen here. This report is by Chart Mogul, and they did a recent study on SaaS retention, and they looked at the impact, and we've seen some of these stats over time. And this was one of the most recent studies I've seen. They found essentially that companies with net retention over 100 grow at 1.5 to 3 times faster than their peers. I mean, it's quite astonishing. And if you look at it visually, you can really just see how impactful focusing on retention can be for your overall growth and sustainable growth, as you said. So again, yes, absolutely. Some of us have been focused on retention. It's doubling down on that or introducing it as a focus area if perhaps you haven't to date.
Yeah. I mean, Charlie, really interesting you say that about like the over 100% retention. Those are the companies that you see that exponential growth. You see that hockey stick growth. It's where all of those retention, all of those cohorts are actually stacking up on top of each other, and they are getting large over time. And that is obviously the goal, right? To have one of the growth charts that look like that. But I mean, when you're thinking about your retention, no two industry is going to be the same, right? There's going to be different retention metrics, whether you're an e-commerce startup or an e-commerce platform, whether you're a subscription consumer app. Like my background, I spent 4 years in New York, and it predominantly in that B2C consumer space. So only since I've been really working with Ikaros and working with other clients have I kind of understood more about the B2B space and how, again, so retention is so important. But the one thing that is consistent between all of these companies and all of these different types of like industry verticals is that if your retention curve does not flatten off at some point, you've got a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And when would you say the right time is for a business to start to focus on retention, considering the different types of industries you've worked in and the different stages of growth? And maybe also, because I keep saying retention first and we keep saying retention first, like let's define that a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, I think if you're thinking about retention and you are seeing anything where you're not stabilizing, it needs to be number one priority, because you will get into the situation where, yes, you can kind of cover up your retention problem if you keep growing with acquisition, right? If you keep filling the funnel, but ultimately you're going to have an issue if you're not able to retain those cohorts of users that you're acquiring. But it needs to be, in my opinion, something that is understood from the get-go. If you're thinking about a company and the addressable audience that they are relevant for, you've got a target market, and the target market is often a finite number. When you begin to get your product out there, you are generally reaching the highest qualified target market. You're getting in front of people that really know that your platform or service will solve a problem that they have. They might be actively looking for it. So these are the users that often when you acquire and you bring onto your platform or service, they often become your power users. They become the ones that are going to be your brand advocates. They're the ones that are they're going to share your platform or service with their friends, and they're really going to help to drive your acquisition as well from like a word of mouth or a referral perspective. If you make sure that you are retaining those users, they're going to be so vital in terms of continuing to drive that acquisition as well. But if your retention is still not in a good place, and some of those users that you're acquiring, that you're your best and most qualified audience, you're only going to start having to go outside to become a less qualified audience. So if you don't get the retention right from the beginning, yes, you can always come back and think about ways to resurrect the audience, ways to get back churned users. And I've seen some very successful strategies work for that, but it's still harder, right? Like you want to be able to retain that audience. You want them to continue using your platform, your product, engaging with your platform and your product, because at the end of the day, more engagement is more opportunities to continue to monetize, to drive up your lifetime value, and again, drive that top of the funnel acquisition. If you think about having a retained user on the platform and having more interactions with your platform or service, whatever type of industry vertical you're in, that's going to increase your lifetime value. If you're thinking about trying to maintain some sort of lifetime value to CAC ratio, often the 3-to-1 gets thrown around, which is looking at how valuable your business is, right? That lifetime value to CAC ratio. If you're able to improve your retention, improve the lifetime value of your users and of your customers, and you wanted to maintain that 3-to-1 lifetime value to CAC ratio, your threshold of what you're willing to be, or what you can spend from a customer acquisition cost generally goes up. And this often gives you an opportunity to tap into audiences that were too expensive, or to try new acquisition channels that previously you didn't have channel model fit, or even opportunities to outbid competitors, say on like Google Ads, right? You might be able to increase your CPCs, outbid competitors, and then gain that competitive advantage. So there's so many benefits to having a retention first strategy, and not just thinking about it as a second thought once your acquisition starts to dip a bit, or once you're in this position where, oh shit, you've got less money to spend, and you've got to really work out what you can be doing and what you can be doing to save your customers.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that, because it's talking about less of a change in skill set or a resource, and more of a mindset shift. So retention first is just, what can you do from the very first point of acquisition to make those smarter acquisitions, so that who you're bringing in, it has a propensity to stick around, to grow with you over time, and to, as you say, create those really healthy CAC to LTV ratios that allow you to open up different approaches to acquisition than you maybe would have had if you only thought of acquisition as a get as many people in the door, and then I just don't care what happens. It's someone else's problem, right? And so absolutely, there's some really effective strategies if you have a strong and healthy existing customer base to better retain them. And we're going to talk about those. But also for our acquisition experts out there, we're talking about a mindset shift that will actually open doors for you despite maybe having some tighter budgets today. So I absolutely love that. And I think maybe this is a great time to talk a little bit about what are the fundamental elements that actually do need to be in place, because you touched on what I think could be quite overwhelming to folks who maybe have no retention strategy in place. But when it comes to taking on this idea of a retention first strategy, what should marketers do? What should businesses do to set themselves up?
Absolutely, Charlie. And it's all good and well to be like, okay, start with your retention strategy and start from the get-go. You really got to work that out from the start. But it's like, okay, where? And what we often find with companies and clients that we, the team at Ikaros come in and kind of set up an engagement with, is we come in and we want to start putting together this growth strategy and what sort of automations they can put in place and what they can be doing in terms of cool experiments, right? But unless they've got their fundamentals in a place, their fundamentals meaning their growth stack, the tools and platforms that they're using and the systems and how they're using data, unless they've got that in a place that is usable and that makes sense and is cohesive, it is absolutely, I'm not going to say impossible, but it is really, really challenging to then start to kind of think about retention and think about growth experiments. So we've found that marketers these days are becoming much more technical, which is really great to see, because I think some level of understanding of how your data is captured, what different systems and tools are triggering different data and different pieces of behavioral elements. It's really important for marketers to understand that, to understand what are the different behavior data that they can use, how that data is being captured, and then what are the different like properties and things within different events that they can use to then create their segmentation. What can they do in terms of the personalization piece? When they can understand the data, they understand where it's being captured, it really leads to marketers being quite self-sufficient and not relying on reaching out to a data analyst or the engineering team to pull a list of a certain segment, right? So having a good understanding of your data and how it's being captured is super important. So we also work quite closely with companies that use our services to understand if their data stack and growth stack is right for them. I'm actually going to pull up a nice little product that the team at Ikaros has created.
Yes, please.
Can you see my screen?
I will add it up now. There you go.
Perfect. It's called Rate My Stack. So quite I think you can understand what it means, but what you can do, you can put your website in here and you can understand the strengths and weaknesses of your existing stack. So,
oh gosh, okay, live demo, let's do it.
Live demo.
Moment of truth, let's see how Ortto stacks up.
Yes, so we are pulling in and understanding all of the different tools and platforms that you're currently using, and we're giving you a score across these different elements. So your qualitative analytics, your quantitative analytics, infrastructure, customer engagement, experimentation. And if you actually scroll through this, you can see, okay, what are some of these must-haves that we've identified as necessary to be able to like go from A to B, and where can you kind of fill those gaps? So I think it's a great tool for companies just to understand like where are their kind of limitations, what are their gaps in their existing stack, and then understanding where they want to go with their strategy, what they might need to add on and kind of bring together. But apart from just having your stack and tools and systems in a good place, I think getting alignment across teams about your customer profile, your ideal customer profile, your target market, who that person is, and really starting from first principles. I think once you have this in place is really the first point, right? And making sure there is alignment across teams.
And how do you see that shaking out for, especially if you think about like the LTV question and tying that into developing your ideal customer profile definition? So my personal experience is I've worked in organizations where we've had a really clear definition of who our ideal customer was. We did a great job bringing those folks in, but then what we found over time is actually there was a cohort within that ICP that retained terribly, and they brought down our overall LTV. Now that took quite a lot of access to data and analysis. So what kind of steps would you recommend for folks who maybe don't have a ton of analytics resources or who are just starting to kind of pick at some of these strings and see where they pull apart?
Yeah, interesting you say that, because I agree. You can have this target persona of who the ideal audience is, but when you pair it back and you really try and understand, like, okay, what are the different demographics or firmographics or these more nuances in the data, it can be quite challenging. But if you don't have, so I always recommend using some sort of like product analytics platform, something like, I mean, there's like free versions of something like Amplitude where you can get quite a lot of information on users that are actively using your platform. Like, what are those segments of your users, those power users who actually are retaining and are showing positive core actions that you're expecting and that are generating revenue for you, how can you start to pair that back and understand who those users are, to give you more insight into how you should kind of segment and target.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that I've found that's also useful is adding another layer. You're starting to touch on it and I interrupted you, so I apologize, but around alignment with other teams. So speaking with your customer facing teams and knowing, right, they're power users, but are they difficult to manage? In other words, they're writing into support constantly. They have a lot of questions. And so, yes, they're very active, but it takes a lot of lift to help them, as opposed to the groups of power users who perhaps are really innovative in their use of your platform. They're driving you forward. They're asking those strategic questions, or they're more self-sufficient. And just having that extra layer has allowed us to refine where we want to focus our time, because the name of the game, at least for my team, is extreme focus.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say that, because if you think about like the product-led growth phenomenon, I would call it, or just people are really focusing on that, right? Like probably it's about how can we get our customers to self-serve? How can we get them to understand the platform, understand the service that is happening, and require as little hand-holding as possible, so they can get to the point of activation. They can do that on their own, really, to understand like the core value proposition of your platform, with as little resources as possible, right? Like it's, again, you're going to have these larger companies, larger enterprise companies that expect more hand-holding or expect more account management. Yeah. But it's really, again, thinking about it from, there could be companies and clients that you're retaining, but is it good retention? Like, is that dollar, is that revenue that they're bringing in, is it worth all of the resources and effort it is to retain that company or that client? So this is, again, going more into like the B2B space, but it's a really important question to have. And any way that you can continue to refine that ideal customer profile based on feedback from your customer success, based on feedback from support, understanding like what are these different pieces of data, not just the product usage data, but how can you be using that to continuously refine what your ideal profile looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on, so fundamentals for retention here. Have the right stack in place, be collecting appropriate data. You've mentioned that kind of like product usage data in particular becomes important. Using all of that to understand your ICP and refine it over time, which I really like that, because I think we got to commit to this ICP and locked in, but refining over time. What else do we need in place in terms of fundamentals?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, for me, I would always say, what is your retention metric, and understanding that it's very different, again, on the type of company you are, type of industry you're in. So understanding what the natural frequency and usage of your platform or service looks like. So I mean, I'm sure you've all heard, like Facebook, for example, they want daily active users because they want people, or TikTok, they want people on their platform all the time. Something like Airbnb, though, they only look at a guest that books an Airbnb accommodation once a year, right? Because not everyone has the luxury of going on a holiday every month or so. So understanding what is the natural frequency and using some of your like product analytics to help find that and refine that will help you to understand, okay, how should we be looking at our retention? But understanding, yes, the target user, your natural frequency, and what is that core action, or what is the experience that you want your users to be doing on your platform, and trying to kind of refine that and have that retention metric will be key to helping to monitor and improve and look at the performance of some of the initiatives that you're working through.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry. No, I was just going to say that I think one call out here is that requires every growth marketer to really deeply understand the value proposition of their platform and their product, so that you can identify what those core metrics are, what those frequency metrics are. If you only have a surface level understanding of your product, you're likely not going to set the right goals for yourself. And so this is your call to get really familiar and comfortable with your product, whatever it might be.
Yeah, understanding the USPs. What is the problem you are solving for your user, right? And making sure, I mean, it kind of ties nicely into then thinking about what are those different campaigns or initiatives that are must-haves with your strategy, because you need to be making sure that you are showing that value, that core problem, and that you're showing that you're solving that to your customers when you start to think about the different campaigns to put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think with some of these fundamentals, do we have everything we need to start thinking about campaigns, or are there other fundamentals that need to be in place before you begin campaign planning?
I think identifying the audience, understanding what your value proposition is, having the right access to data. I think you can start to then, I mean, when I start thinking about campaign planning or what are these different initiatives, I like to kind of take a step back and understand, what does the industry look like? What's the industry vertical? What's the company type? Because there's gonna be changes and different initiatives you put in place based on the type of audience you're serving. But I think starting to plan out and work out what are those like must-have campaigns makes sense, getting something in place, and then really working from there once you do have these benchmarks and you do see what's working, how you can then continue to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do that. Let's talk tactical. Let's share some examples. And you're starting to touch on something that I feel very passionately about when it comes to any kind of retention first strategy is you really need to have your customer journey mapped out. And I mean like actually mapped out. So I have mine, I use FigJam. I've got it all mapped out. It's wild and wonderful and full of shapes. But I know from the point of acquisition, all the different touch points that I have all the way through to retention, at least the core ones, as well as all of the channels that feed in and how they all weave together. And this is, I found really useful because you firstly, kind of like, how am I trying to move people from step to step to step? And you also, as you map that out, likely are going to identify gaps in where you're not automating, where you're not working with these customers or prospects to move them through your funnel. So for me, I think step one, map your customer journey. And then from there, I think you're right. There are probably going to be different types of campaigns and initiatives that you need depending on your industry and business. I think we could probably fairly generalize that there are some categories that you would maybe touch on. So maybe we could run through some of those and share some examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for me, the first touch point and the first experience you have with a customer is one of the most important. Really, again, it's more of that all of your customers are going to see this, and it's really how can you, to me, it's this activation point or onboarding, right? So it's how quickly can you get users to experience the core value that your product offers, and it's thinking about how can we decrease that time to value. And I think if people are familiar with the aha moment, right? What's that aha moment? What is that moment when they're like, oh, this makes sense. I get it. I get why I'm using this platform. I think one of the most famous examples of that is like the 7 friends in 10 days from Facebook, right? It's like you get to that point, you understand why you're using that platform, right? So that onboarding, that welcome activation is so important. Really setting up the stage for your retention.
Yeah. And I wanted to share an example of this that I thought is really well done from ClassPass. So I went back and found my ClassPass welcome email. ClassPass, for those of you who don't know it, it's a app that allows you to book in different like gym and wellness sessions from any of the participating vendors. So rather than having a gym membership at a single place, you can go and book into all different types of classes. So for me, this appeals because I can't commit to any one gym. So I joined and they sent me a welcome right away. And as you can see, they instantly, they personalized in the onboarding process, I selected what kinds of classes I was interested in. And then they showed in that welcome email actually classes that aligned with that interest. And what they're trying to do, as you're saying, is drive me to book a class, have that aha moment where I'm like, right, this is meeting my needs. So I thought ClassPass's welcome email was a really great example of timeliness, personalization, and driving to that ideal behavior. So wanted to just share one example that I thought was well done.
Charlie, it's really interesting you say that, because it's like also thinking through that onboarding journey. We often think about how can we reduce friction so much that we can like increase conversion, right?
Yeah.
But something that you can see in this ClassPass example is you've actually added a few things during your onboarding, right? And that's what I call like adding positive friction. We are actually changing and adding different questions or different asking for insight into who our audience is to then be able to further personalize and make sure that experience is exactly catered to what you're looking for, right? So you could have signed up to ClassPass and just given an email and a name, and they wouldn't know where you live. They wouldn't know what kind of activities you enjoy doing. You might really love boxing, but they're sending you things that are only for cycling. So I think adding some of these friendly hurdles during your onboarding, it kind of serves twofold. You can like weed out some of the half-hearted users who aren't really interested and committed to what what your value is. And it also sets these kind of expectations, makes users somewhat feel invested in the process as well. I think there's the user psychology. When you start going through an onboarding and you've invested time doing something, it's like you want to make sure you kind of complete it. So there's a lot of these different like user psychology, I wouldn't say hacks, but like better understanding how how humans interact and what motivates someone is super important for marketers to understand when they start to strategize some of these experiences, whether it's like your onboarding and activation, or even when it's starting to think about, okay, you've got people to that activation point, they've experienced that core value, but then you're in this like middle ground of like your middle retention. And it's thinking about how can you make sure that you are continuing to drive that core action? How can you get these kind of rewards happening where people are having these triggers, whether it's an internal or an external trigger, but how can you develop this habit? And you need to develop the habit. I feel like marketers too often think, okay, great, someone has signed up and they understand the core value proposition, but like they're not going to continue using the platform, because the hardest thing to change is human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if your frequency is very long, like the Airbnb example that you use, it becomes all the more important to think about how you create a habit, but it's got this really long interval in between it. So thinking about habit creation and your frequency and how you develop an appropriate campaign to meet those unique needs for your business, that becomes all the more important. And I'll just come back and harp on that customer journey map and thinking about all the different touch points. And I think nurture, like a content nurture, is another category of campaign that I would mention, whether that's pre-purchase or it's post-purchase, and kind of maintaining coverage and nurturing across the board. That might look like, I'll use Airbnb again. They share like all of their different like spotlight locations, and I get those. And even though I'm not going to book every month, they're front of mind. Or a B2B company, maybe you have a bunch of thought leadership content and you're sharing that with your audience at a, maybe 10 to 14 day interval ratio. They only purchase once a month or on an annual subscription, whatever your model is, but you're staying front of mind. So I think more of that kind of like long-term content nurture is important for the habit creation and frequency intervals that you mentioned as well.
Absolutely. Like habit creation is not necessarily going to happen for someone that like buys a house, right? You might buy a house twice in your lifetime or three, So it's thinking about like, what are these other mechanisms and content, right? What are these other like offshoots to your product that you can be helping to educate your customers about? and make sure that your brand is still top of mind when they're thinking about, oh, actually, I'm going to sell my house. Should I use this company, right? Or something like that. You just got to make sure you're understanding like how you can utilize your content or educational material to still continue to drive value for your end customer.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Another category of campaign that you should consider if you're taking on this retention first approach would be ongoing product activation and engagement. So most of us, once we have a customer come in, perhaps there's a particular set of features that they have really come in for, and there's additional available to them, or we're releasing new features or products and we need to educate. And product activation and engagement is all about helping your customers realize increased value out of the purchase that they've already made, or perhaps even expand into additional feature sets that will unlock more revenue. I have a couple examples I can share of this one. One would be from Canva. So we use Canva at Ortto for some of our self-serve design needs. And they release new features all the time. Let's see if this is the right one. So they release new features, but also I only use a very small subset of their features. And they do a great job of delivering emails to me, showing me features that I haven't tapped into yet. So get ideas flowing with whiteboards. This is something I had never used, and it's for collaboration. They did a great job of touching on what the value proposition was of this feature that I am paying for, but I'm not using, and encouraging me to try it today. So I think this is a really good example of ongoing product activation and engagement to unlock more value.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that up, Charlie, because I think that like with product activation and thinking about how to best communicate or what does that journey look like? Often we should really take a step back and look at users or customers that are already using a particular feature or product, and diving into like their customer journey or what is their path to use that feature look like. So sometimes you can be like, okay, this whiteboard feature from Canva, but let's look at the 10,000 users that are already using it, right? Did they read a piece of blog content from us? Did they go through and actually do our educational like tutorial on the platform? And how can we use some of those insights into the journey and the experience of that segment already using that platform to then educate additional users and provide resources that way?
Yeah, I love that. And I think what you're touching on there is this idea of having that kind of like complete view of cohorts of users. How did we acquire them? What like engagements and touch points have they had with our brand across all of the different channels? Which groups are doing the behaviors that I like and might be worth prioritizing? And then the converse is, what are the cohorts of users who aren't doing what I want them to do? And then using all of that insight to develop your automations in this case.
Totally. And I think I've read this really interesting article that is one of my favorites that is somewhat not related to this. It's about product market fit, right? But the way that they approached the methodology about how they were going to define whether they had product market fit was super interesting. It's an article that was, the article's about Superhuman, the email marketing platform where you can quickly like zoom through your inbox and use your keyboard keys to do different shortcuts. But they talk about the product market fit as like looking at their entire customer base in this quadrant. And they ask a question. It's, if Superhuman no longer existed, how disappointed would you be? And the people that are extremely disappointed are their like product market fit category. And then they've got somewhat disappointed, and then the bottom two quadrants are like not really disappointed. So the bottom two quadrants are probably users that are not their ideal target market. And they really wanted to focus on these two top quadrants about the extremely disappointed, which you would say are the users that are going to be your power users that are going to retain. And then this somewhat disappointed. So they think about making feature enhancements and making updates to their product by making sure that they equally balance these two groups, because they're wanting these group of users that are somewhat disappointed to eventually become extremely disappointed, right? To then really get value and really think that the service that they're offering is great. But at the same time, making sure that they're balancing and having the core, like, retained power users that they're continuing to find value in the platform.
I love that. That's a really interesting approach to identifying your ideal customer profile and to product innovation. So that's really interesting. We have touched on welcome and onboarding and activation as kind of like a category where you should focus, make sure that you have coverage there. We've talked about just ongoing nurture to provide value, to help users, do their jobs better, to focus on habit creation. Touched a bit on product activation and engagement. Some of the kind of categories I would say to kind of tick all of your boxes would be anything related to customer loyalty and appreciation. So not waiting until it's time for a customer to purchase again or decide to renew, making sure that they're feeling appreciated. I think that's another category that's important. And I actually tried to find an example of this and I couldn't. So I think that the call out here is maybe this is a particularly underrepresented area that we all need to focus in on. I'm not sure if you have any examples you can share.
So, I mean, it kind of relates somewhat to also that, like, that habit creation loop, right? Like, we want to be celebrating those positive engagements and milestones with our customers. And sometimes that's like on platform, or you can send like a happy birthday message. I don't know. There's all these different ways you can continue to make sure that your brand is becoming top of mind, but then you're also, celebrating the journey with your customer. A few examples of things that are like quite commonly recognized in this area is like the MailChimp monkey that gives you a high five when you send an email. And just that's more like on platform, right? But sometimes you don't have the ability to influence the product, and often marketers don't. We sometimes are like don't have direct access to engineering resources, and so we have to do things through different channels, right? How can you send an in-app message to someone once they complete their third core action that says, hey, like, great work, you are starting to form really positive habits of using this platform. And how can you continue to make sure that your customers know that they're on the right track and that they're a value customer.
Yeah, I love that because it actually speaks to something that we have done at Ortto, which is less of like discrete initiatives to celebrate customers, but more about what are all the existing touch points where we can work that in. So for example, in our own in-app product onboarding, we have a point of celebration once you finish your onboarding checklist. So not a net new initiative, but it's how can we just take a moment to recognize and celebrate? And I think if you can look for those points to surprise and delight, if you don't have control over creating something net new, that's a really great step in the right direction.
Absolutely. And if you can't put a checklist like that within your products, like, there are pieces that you can piece together with your data to have it actually form within like an email or something. So there's always kind of workarounds that you can do to achieve a similar outcome. I think one other really interesting campaign or type of initiative that I like to focus on with clients is around this like NPS and how we can use your NPS to kind of gear and understand more about your customer. I actually, Charlie, was looking through Ortto's templates and saw a really cool, you do exactly what I recommend doing. So let me just pull this up. Give me a second. I saw this template. So the understanding of like communicating. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Asking and understanding where your customer's at. Like, are they promoters or are they detractors, right? And even this understanding of who are our detractors, let's make sure that we're getting in front of them and sending an email to understand why. What can we be doing differently, right? Like, I received an email from a company literally the other day asking this, and I actually replied back to it, and I was like, I couldn't open your application. And it's really good feedback, right? For them to, and it's pretty simple, but I always implement something like this with clients we work with, especially ones that might not get past onboarding or might not get to that activation. It might be the final step in that flow, but understanding why. And then really they might reply back with one piece, but then it's like continuing to ask why and get as much information from your customer as possible. But I love what you kind of do here, right? So after you've got this NPS and you know that someone is a promoter, what can you be doing to generate reviews? I'm actually implementing this with a client at the moment, and we've got a few different branching factors, right? So thinking about, do they have the app installed or do they not have the app installed? If they're web only, we're actually doing a 50-50 split between generating reviews for Google and Facebook. If they do have the app, it's like, okay, let's branch again. Is it iOS or Android? And then how do we want to drive those users towards those app stores so that we can start to generate and have this as just an automation that exists and is always on.
Love it. Love it. And just automating that kind of thing, it takes so much more time off your plate, which means that then rather than going out and asking for those reviews, you can take the feedback, I couldn't open your app, and actually work with the dev team on getting that fixed. Spend your time there. Or if there's a really rich piece of feedback, get in touch and have a conversation. If you can free up your time by automating things, like, oh my gosh, the amount of like richness that you can repurpose your time into is so worth it.
Absolutely. And I think having those conversations with your customers as much as you can is so valuable. I remember when one of my first jobs that I was at when I was back in New York, I actually had phone calls with like 100 customers, and mainly customers that had really good retention. And I asked them to tell me, who do you think this platform's for, in your own words? And they were describing themselves and their peers of who would be using the platform, but they were using words that I would never have thought of. As marketers, sometimes we have this kind of idea in our head of who this platform's for, what are their problems, but having it actually come from the customer and having them articulate these words. Like, I recorded all of these interviews, I transcribed them, I then bucketed them into different like USPs. So what were they all saying? What are the USPs that are most relevant? It's a really quick and hacky way to do your segmentation if you don't have things that are already set up. But being able to hear things from your customers in their own words, we then use a lot of the words that they used in our ads. And when we create ads that are speaking to your target personas in the way that they want to be defined or heard, or what the problems they're having, we were able to see much stronger conversion performance.
And I'm just seeing this like loop that you're creating of speaking in the language that attracts the people who actually have the problems you can solve. Therefore, they're more likely to stick around because they see value, and just that like beautiful retention loop, I would call it. I love it. It's such a great idea. I might steal that from you, in fact. Well, we're coming close to up on time. So I think a good place to wrap up would just be any parting words of wisdom, any gotchas that marketers should look out for as they are starting to implement some of the suggestions we've shared today.
Yeah. I think just as much as you can ignore retention for its older sister acquisition or, the other thing that's a bit more attractive, it's so important. And it can often be ignored by looking at the wrong metrics. So I know most people who are probably going to be watching this will be retention marketers or lifecycle marketers. So I think everyone can agree that it is super important. But it just needs to be prioritized, and it needs to be understood across teams about how important it is and how much of an impact that it has to the overall growth of a company. I also think that because retention is further down this funnel, we often, it takes a long time to run experiments and run initiatives and get good statistical significant data back. So understanding if there's any leading indicators that will help, like that will tell you what your retention is or give you a good idea, will help you to increase throughput and velocity of what you're doing. Which often in startups and smaller companies, you really need to be focusing on this experimentation velocity and
Yeah.
seeing how you can get things out the door.
Yeah, I love that. I think I completely agree. And I think with everything that you've just mentioned and everything we touched on today, I'd almost think of our conversation as like a checklist for the things that need to be in place. Look through all of it. Is it your tech stack, your data, your alignment with cross-functional teams, your understanding of metrics, both like your core retention metrics and then the leading indicators, customer journey mapping, campaigns, all of this, which by the way, perhaps we'll just like wrap up in a doc and like send a list over, because I realize that's quite a lot. But my word of wisdom is look across it all. If any of those feels particularly like tricky, like we super don't have that, we're really unaligned here, that's where I'd start. Like just tackle the biggest beast first that would stand in your way so that you can start to create efficiency. Because as you said, it's about like being able to move quickly and nimbly. So bite off the tricky bits first. This doesn't have to be handled like in concurrent order as we've discussed today. And I think you'll be well on your way to seeing some change happen if you do it that way.
Yeah, I just completely agree with that. It's looking at like how are you prioritizing your different initiatives, right? What is going to actually drive the impact? But then at the same time, like you've got to look at it from like a prioritization model or framework, right? So like we at Ikaros use like an ICE methodology. So it's like impact, confidence, and effort across teams, right? So often there's things that you within a lifecycle marketing or a marketing org can get out the door pretty quickly that doesn't involve having to pull on other teams and engineering resources and whatnot, which often is really difficult to get capacity. So understanding that, kind of putting together your initiatives and having some sort of prioritization framework attached to it to understand like, how do we move? What can we do and what's going to drive impact? And looking at what the audience sizes across each of your different segments of what you're trying to put together looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Love a prioritization model.
Love it. I mean, love a good methodology, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if we have any questions, we can take them now. I'm just checking the chat. It does look like one question: how do you retain customers for a product or service that is a grudge purchase?
Right. Okay. Grudge purchase. What would you say is a grudge purchase? So something that like someone purchased something that it wasn't from a place of them feeling like guilty. They purchased something because they were guilty.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard the frame grudge purchase. Oh, okay. A grudge buy is something we need or must do, but it's the last thing we want to do with our time or money. Okay. Yeah.
Interesting question.
Yeah.
I tell you what, let me think on that. And whoever asked that question, I would love to kind of come back to you, because I feel like in being conscious of time, having 2 minutes left, I don't think I can think that quickly on the fly. But there's definitely going to be things you can be doing to retain an audience. But again, when you want to try to bring people back and you want to identify that trigger, which is going to develop a habit or retain someone, you don't necessarily want to be car servicing, for example. I'm seeing this.
Yeah.
Let me come back to you, but you don't want to necessarily be bringing up like, let me come back to this question.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think connect with us on LinkedIn and we can chat. One of the first things that comes to mind is, if it's something you have to do regardless, how can you position yourself as the best option when you have to do this thing you don't like to do? So have to go to the dentist. How can you be the like least inconvenient, the most kind, the most courteous, the most convenient dental offering out there? Car servicing, same thing. So I think for me, this comes back to positioning, and then beyond that with like the ongoing retention campaigns. Let's chat more, because this is definitely an interesting one.
And just following up what you were saying, Charlie, I think in situations like that, when you've got a product or service like that, it's all about like the customer service and support, right? So you've got to go above and beyond and differentiate yourself from your competitors in that way. And often it comes down to yeah, how can you be delivering better quality?
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing would be like, I just thought of I'll do some research on this and follow up, but there's a psychological principle around like affirmative lock-in. So if I decide that I'm happy with the service, I'm more likely to believe that at a higher level versus if somebody just told me the service was good. So how can you get people to decide that they're happy? I'll remember the principle and share it with you. But there's some tactics related to that you can use.
Yeah. I've also got a really good PDF with a lot of these different psychological like biases that we have that you can use within marketing, which is like really powerful. I've got a few different resources that I'd love to share with people that are listening to this. So maybe Charlie, we can collaborate and put together a list of things that we've touched on as well. But it's been awesome chatting with you. I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks for jumping on. Thanks for the chat. It was really enjoyable. I think, let's package up some of what we discussed, share it with everyone. But the invitation is there to connect with us both on LinkedIn, and we're happy to have a chat one-on-one. As you can tell, we love a good chat. So but thank you to everyone who has tuned in. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to speaking.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.